A symbol of Turkish national pride that became a symbol of excess.
People didn't really know what the dinosaurs were about.
An isolated refuge in Brazil, tainted by stigma.
So it really kind of became a cursed place in the eyes of the population.
A defiant monolith on the Estonian coast that birthed a revolution.
They had a fierce nationalism, they had a fierce desire to be free.
And the tragic demise of a sprawling estate in Germany.
This kind of behavior was a terrible scandal.
Decaying relics, ruins of lost worlds, sites haunted by the past, their secrets waiting to be revealed. In Turkey's capital, Ankara, is a collection of oddities slowly rotting away.
We're in an inner city neighborhood, and all of a sudden it's these spooky piles of toys everywhere, stretching on as far as the eye can see.
You see what appears to be bits of dead dinosaurs rotting in the sun.
There's a cable car tower, but where are the cables? And where are the cars?
These crumbling curiosities are the result of a grand ambition fueled by greed and vanity.
This is a cautionary tale of a powerful politician who thought he could change a city's culture.
He used bulldozers to rewrite the history of Turkey.
Ya şöyle ikiye bölebilirim. Bir Ankaralı olarak, bir de gazeteci olarak. Yani konunun uzmanı değilim elbette. Yani bu tema parklar nasıl işletilir?
Gökçe Tahinçioglu has been following the story of this place from its beginnings. But there are some things that still baffle him.
Neden dinozorlar olduğunu hiçbir Ankaralı bilmiyor. Yani bu soru çok soruldu. Hani bizim
The decaying dinosaurs offer a window into Turkey's economic rollercoaster past. They're part of what was once Europe's biggest theme park, a £213 million project conceived in 2013. This is Wonderland.
Turkey was going through a huge building boom as the economy took off in the early 2000s. They were spending over $100 billion on new airports, roads, tunnels, bridges, and railways.
Wonderland was the brainchild of Ankara's mayor, Melik Gökçek, who had overseen many controversial developments in the capital.
He'd already demolished much of Ankara's finest old architecture to make way for concrete and empty shopping malls.
şöyle tabii ki bir seçim şampiyonu. Yani Ankara ve İstanbul Büyükşehir Belediye Başkanlıkları Türkiye'de bakanlıklardan önemlidir. Çok yüksek bütçeli harcamalar yapma yetkiniz vardır, işe alım yetkiniz vardır, yatırım ihale yetkiniz vardır. Bakanlıklarda bu kadar kaynak bulamazsınız. Belediyelerdedir bu kaynak, merkezi iktidar dışında.
The city mayor decided that this would be one of the biggest amusement parks in the world, right in the center of Ankara.
So this place occupied 14 million square feet. It had over 2,000 attractions. It was going to bring in 5 million visitors a year.
This didn't just have one roller coaster, it had 17.
There is only one other park in the entire world that has more than this.
From the outset, Wonderland was entangled in controversy, much like some of Gökçek's previous projects.
The problem was that they were building on protected public land, the Ataturk Forest Farm. And this wasn't just any protected public land. It had been gifted to the people by Turkey's greatest national hero and founding father, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk.
Ataturk's memory is almost sacred today, as he created the first truly secular Turkish nation from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire dismantled at the end of the First World War. Ataturk was really the first leader to try to transform Turkey into what we would understand in the West as being a modern nation.
It seemed that Gökçek had no desire to preserve Ataturk's legacy.
Just imagine they were building this on Central Park, whilst knocking down the Lincoln Memorial at the same time. Many Turks felt this was an encroachment on public space and an insult to their national heritage.
Ataturk's forest farm used to boast over 20 acres of green space and trees. You can still see some greenery, but most of what's visible has been built on or built over.
Bir sabah uyandık, şehrin bir yerinde devasa robotlar, bir sabah uyandık devasa dinozorlar.
As construction dragged on, the mayor came under increased scrutiny.
Costs were mounting, and people began to ask questions of Gökçek himself. There were accusations of corrupt deals, of cozy contracts, allegations that he was engaging in electoral fraud.
In the 2014 mayoral elections, after 20 years already in post, Gökçek won a 5th term by the slenderest of margins, but he couldn't account for the serious voting anomalies.
As his popularity plummeted, discontent was also growing against his party, led by President Erdogan.
Turkey's economic boom did not last, and with the crash came an attempted coup in 2016 against Erdogan.
Looking for a scapegoat to blame for Turkey's problems, Erdogan turned to the mayors of its largest cities. And for Gökçek, already mired in controversy, the game was up.
After 24 years in office, the flamboyant figure was forced into resignation. The next mayor would inherit a half-built theme park and an eye-watering bill that was now over £650 million. Over budget and behind schedule, the pressure was on to open its doors.
People said the park just wasn't ready.
In May 2017, 4 years after construction began, Wonderland welcomed in the Turkish press for a sneak preview of what it had to offer. Gökçek, although no longer mayor of the city, was still closely involved in the project.
But everything didn't go quite as planned.
Bu roller coaster aslında parkın en meşhur oyuncağı. Çünkü park açılmadan bir süre önce Melih Gökçek büyükelçileri, iş insanlarını, Ankara'nın tanınmış simalarını buraya davet etti. Ve sürekli bu roller coaster'la bir görüntü verildi. İşte bu görüntü vermelerin birinde de o söz konusu sıkışma yaşandı. Ve daha sonra anlaşıldı ki sistem zaman zaman bunu yapıyor. Oyuncaktaki teknik bir arızadan bu kaynaklanıyor.
In front of all the press cameras and with Gökçek on it, the roller coaster got stuck. They filmed Gökçek having to walk down the emergency escape route. It was a complete disaster.
On the 20th of March 2019, Turkey's answer to Disneyland officially opened to the public. At the launch ceremony, President Erdogan, standing next to a model dinosaur, proclaimed the park the nation's symbol of pride.
Without a doubt, the star attraction was the Lightspeed roller coaster, 3,000 feet long, up to 100 feet high, and with 10 inversions.
But only 2 days after the inauguration, another roller coaster broke down. It set the tone for what was to come.
After all the excitement, the park's reviews were disappointing. The themes didn't really make any sense. People didn't really know what the dinosaurs were about.
The timing of the opening was also suspicious. Only a few weeks before the mayoral elections.
If they had hoped that opening the park weeks before the election was going to seal the deal, they were wrong. It's not how it worked out, and the party of Domjüch was thrown out of power.
Domjüch's vanity project would soon suffer the same fate. Less than a year after it opened, the park was forced to permanently close its doors.
Wonderland ultimately failed because it was way too big. Ankara could never provide the visitor numbers to make it work.
Today, Wonderland is slowly decaying. Yet it still remains a serious bone of contention for Ankara's residents.
Wonderland was seen as a huge political project that the public paid for. And in the end, that's not even really what angered people. You know, it was the fact that Domjüch had done significant damage to the culture of modern Turkey and to the legacy of its founding father.
The park was themed to tell the story of Turkey in 7 distinct stages, from dinosaurs and cavemen to the modern day, but with no space given to Turkey's period as a modern republic. This was the wrong dream at the wrong place in the wrong time, and the results were a nightmare.
In northwestern Brazil are a set of ruins consumed by the roots of the rainforest.
We're in the heart of the Amazon, on the banks of the Rio Negro, not far from Manaus, the major city in the central Amazon in Brazil.
It's a historic site. Until recently, this would have been accessible only by a boat trip up the Amazon.
In the decay are signs of fading luxury.
The main premises are imposing and grandiose, like a mansion or even a colonial building.
And then you start to see other things like a chapel, but it's been completely overtaken by this lush jungle foliage.
None of the buildings have roofs anymore, and the walls are completely exposed to the elements.
It looks like this place once housed a community, but what happened to them? Where did they go?
What was once the lifeblood of this community would end up destroying it.
Though built with high hopes, this place descended into mistrust and violence.
Raul Perigo Melo de Oliveira has lived in this area all his life and is fascinated by the archaeology of these ruins.
Eu penso assim, só de estar aqui, eu acho que para muitos é privilégio, né, de estar na Amazônia, mas me dá sentimento pouco de tristeza também, saber que a gente tem uma estrutura dessa que poderia estar sendo muito melhor utilizada, né?
This building sits in a village called Paricatuba.
Today, this location isn't that far from a major city, but when it was built, it was very remote.
It was originally built in the 19th century to house and train Italian immigrants.
At the time, Italy was experiencing widespread unemployment. Brazil offered the opportunity to start over.
During the 1890s, the Brazilian rubber industry was booming, and they desperately needed workers to keep production high.
All around the world, there was an enormous demand for rubber, but it had to come from rubber trees that were native to the Amazon and didn't grow in too many other places.
The trees were found in abundance in Paricatuba, so a hostel was needed to accommodate the Italian workers.
Assim, olha, a logística de construção aqui dessa obra, se a gente for parar para pensar, em 1898, 1900, todo o material importado. Então, os tijolos vieram da França, vieram tijolos de Portugal, de Lisboa, veio material, as lajotas hidráulicas também são importadas, vieram de Portugal. Isso tudo transportado da Europa para cá em navios a vapor.
So the main building was really quite beautiful. It had these lovely colonial windows, beautiful wood floors, and traditional Chinese porcelain imported all the way from Europe.
But as the hostel neared completion, the rubber industry fell into a sudden and terminal decline. The building, no longer needed to house workers, would be given a new purpose, one that offered hope to those on the margins of society.
Logo após o abandono, né, e o governo retomar aqui e concluir a obra aqui, tornou-se o Liceu de Artes e Ofícios do Amazonas. Então ele tinha um foco em trabalhar principalmente a questão de utilização da madeira.
It was said that this was another attempt to repopulate the area, but this time with orphaned and abandoned children from other regions of Brazil. They brought in teenagers with the hope that they would learn vocational skills when otherwise they might have been out on the street, engaged in gangs, or even worse. They were taught carpentry and other crafts, using wood from the surrounding forest.
The institution was managed by priests from France, and it was named after Afonso Pena, who was president of Brazil at the time.
But the extreme dangers of the jungle would soon threaten this new enterprise.
Então, na época, o que acontece? As pessoas não queriam, já havia o estigma que existe até hoje. Caramba, estamos na Amazônia, vai ter onça, jacaré, sucuri, então, malária. O povo não queria vir para cá, sair de Rio, São Paulo, para vir para o interior da Amazônia no navio a vapor. Então, a escola acabou não perdurando, durou apenas 4 anos, e novamente aqui foi desativado.
The problem with this location is that it was just too hard to get to and too difficult to return from. So they decided to turn this weakness into their advantage.
Paricatuba became a refuge for a group of people feared by society.
Leprosy, or Hansen's disease, at the time was seen as one of the worst diseases you could get. Because of a complete misunderstanding about the spread of disease, people were ostracized and imprisoned against their will.
They wanted them out of sight and out of mind.
Leprosy was first identified in this region in 1854. As cases increased in the 1900s, efforts were made to bring the spread under control.
Around 1915, doctors in central Brazil started making demands for a modern facility to treat and house people with leprosy. For the doctors, this location seemed perfect. It was right on the river. It was close to the city of Manaus, so they'd be able to get supplies and bring their patients in without having to travel long distances through the jungle.
The patients, however, did not come here voluntarily.
What we know now is that leprosy actually doesn't spread that easily. But the real epidemic at the time was fear, and it was rife. People with leprosy were snatched off the streets of Manaus without a word of warning. Families were split apart with no clue as to where their loved ones had been taken.
The hospital had the capacity to house more than 300 sufferers.
It was quite an extensive compound. There was a chapel, a convent, a dining hall, spaces for medical treatment, disinfection. So it was, for its day, a modern, sophisticated retreat for people with this terrible disease.
Agora nós estamos na área da cozinha. Essa cozinha funcionou principalmente na época em que aqui foi hospital para tratamento de doentes de hanseníase, 1924 a 1962. A hanseníase, ela exigia o isolamento das pessoas entre doentes e sadios. Então a comida era feita do lado de lá pelos funcionários, era passada por aqui, depois ela era encaminhada até o refeitório, que é esse grande salão à nossa frente.
There was also segregation between patients.
A área que a gente está aqui era a ala feminina, né? A fachada do prédio. Ela consistia em recepção, triagem, enfermarias e toda a área esquerda era a área masculina, toda a área direita era a área feminina. E isso ocorria justamente por quê? Porque, por conta da doença, era proibido o contato sexual entre os internos, para que não gerassem crianças que poderiam ser contaminadas pela doença.
The afflicted lived a painful life in a world cut off from the rest of society. Even then, their mere presence struck terror into the hearts of the local populace.
There was such a fear of contagion in the communities around them that the patients were asked not to use paper money, even inside the compound, because that money might get into general circulation and carry the bacteria out to the public.
The boats that brought supplies here wouldn't actually stop to unload. Rather, they would just dump their cargoes onto the beaches and cast off. They wanted to spend as little time here as possible.
This epitomized the very real social segregation that lepers were subject to at the time and the terrible experiences of those who were forced to live here.
And 30 miles downriver, in the city of Manaus, a storm was brewing that threatened the hospital's very existence.
People believed that the disease was being carried downstream, contaminating the whole of the city. This led to public outcry that supposed contamination was spreading to areas once considered safe.
The level of fear was so extreme that eventually all the patients were moved to another hospital. By the 1960s, Paricatuba was completely deserted.
The reason Paricatuba has been untouched since the hospital was closed is because of the horrible stigma attached to leprosy. So it really kind of became a cursed place in the eyes of the population.
The ruins of Paricatuba served many functions throughout their existence. Even today, people are still drawn to the remote location.
It's the perfect site for tourists and locals alike to visit to take in all the natural wonder. In 2015, it earned classification as an intangible cultural heritage site by the state of Amazonas.
In Estonia's capital, Tallinn, a peculiar building stands out on the shores of the Baltic Sea.
As you approach the water's edge, there's this structure that's very striking. It looks almost like a sawed-off Aztec pyramid.
It seems strange and out of place with this modern, thriving city.
In a prime location on Tallinn's harbour, this concrete behemoth sits empty, save for the occasional Hollywood production.
It's pristine, preserved at the moment of its abandonment.
This place is tied to both Estonia's Soviet past and its fight for independence.
They had a fierce hatred of Russian overlordship. They had a fierce desire to be free. So the singing revolutions was the Estonian answer.
There are people who claim that this building is something Soviet. I don't agree with this. It's totally mysterious, something what will never be built nowhere in Europe in near future.
Architect and politician Ignár Fuke has had a hand in this peculiar structure from its earliest days.
Influence is pyramids and ziggurats all around the world with these crazy staircases and architectonics, which is simple and unfriendly.
The Linna Hall would play a pivotal role in defining modern Estonian history, and Ignár was in the thick of the action. Its story begins in 1974, when Moscow was selected to host the 1980 Olympic Games.
The Baltic nations, especially Estonia, always saw themselves as something very different from Russian culture. When the Russians recapture the area at the end of the Second World War, they see them as an occupying force.
But it was impossible to agitate against Soviet power for the simple reason that the KGB was installed everywhere and would clamp down at the first sign of dissent.
As part of the Soviet Union, Estonia was brought into Moscow's Olympic preparations.
Part of the Summer Olympics in 1980 had called for a big yachting regatta. You couldn't do that in Moscow, so they had to have somewhere with a seacoast. That's why they choose Estonia.
The Olympics was the Soviets' chance to showcase socialism on the world stage, and Tallinn was to play host alongside Moscow.
But then they have to give the town a complete makeover. They refurbish hundreds of these beautiful old buildings in squares in Tallinn.
The Estonians poured millions of rubles into Olympic projects. Among the most impressive of these projects were the Tallinn Olympic Yachting Center, the Olympia Hotel, and the 1,000-foot TV tower.
The Linnahall was another of these high-profile projects. It opened in 1980 as the V.I. Lenin Palace of Culture and Sport.
There was a program of entertainment planned to run in this hall throughout the Olympics. It was a chance for the Soviets to showcase the cultural, technological, and economic achievements of socialism.
Linnahall is an advert. It's an advert to the world.
Under this roof, there are ice hockey stadium. And over here, there is a main concert hall for 4,200 people. Country was closed, but Olympics gave us some kind of hope.
Yet, a fateful event was about to derail the years of planning.
Much to the shock of the world, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan with a massive force.
Major powers like the United States, West Germany, Canada, China, all decided to boycott the Games.
In total, 65 countries refused to send athletes.
In many ways, it was not a success story. But for Estonia, it was a window to the world.
The international response added fuel to the fire of a budding independence movement.
It showed us that the Soviet system was vulnerable. It gave us some experience that Estonians not alone, because this boycott was progressive. This supported our independence. It's a good memory.
The one room at Linnahall that's still in use holds reminders of this time.
This is a recording studio, and Estonians managed to make music and songs as a political instrument.
What began as a revival of Estonian folk songs in the 1980s became known as the Singing Revolution.
These large groups of people would come together and sing nationalist songs in the Estonian language.
You had a crowd of 100,000 singing these national songs in defiance of the Soviet authorities.
We were happy to have 3 Estonians, nice young guys, composer and poet, who composed 6 songs which were tremendously powerful and energetic to push people to change the world.
As a rising young politician, Ignaz Fuke was at the center of this new independence movement.
In 1987, in May, I organized first legal but official opposition organization in not only in Estonia but in the Soviet Union. We established all kinds of declaration and proposal to change Estonian life. In this hall, in Linnahall was an official and formal constitutional assembly to establish Popular Front. It was 1st of October 1988.
Citizens of Tallinn gathered on the steps of Linnahall to celebrate this momentous stride towards independence.
After the Popular Front was organized, the Supreme Council adopted the Declaration of Sovereignty of Estonia, and as me, I wrote the first sketch of that declaration. This is a history.
In August 1991, a coup in Moscow that would trigger the collapse of the Soviet Union gave Estonia the opportunity to finally declare independence.
This new country finds itself inheriting the V.I. Lenin Palace of Culture and Sport. Well, the first thing they did was they changed the name to Linnahall, which is Estonian for City Hall.
Having witnessed a great turning point in history, Linnahall's position in Tallinn's future became uncertain.
And the Estonians have struggled to do something with this place. It's outsized for a country as small as Estonia. They've tried to use it as a concert hall.
There was a nightclub called Lucky Luke's, but it burned down. You can see that there's a general trajectory of sad decline here.
This was a building that had lost its direction.
Without a clear plan for how best to use Linnahall, it finally closed its doors in 2010.
If I stand here, I feel a great sadness. What kind of treasure we have lost.
Recently, its most prominent use was as a filming location for Christopher Nolan's film Tenet.
There's a scene that is supposedly playing out in the Opera House in Kyiv, Ukraine, but it's actually filmed in the 4,200-seat auditorium deep inside the Linnahall in Tallinn.
You can't ignore the fact that this is a cultural icon, and it's entangled in the history of Estonia, in Estonia's fraught relationship with the Soviet Union, and in the story of Estonia's independence.
"50 miles north of Germany's capital, Berlin, is a ghostly, derelict estate.
We're in this gentle landscape of farmlands, forests, and lakes. Then you see these white buildings and a few dead trees just scattered around them.
The plaster is peeling. They're in pretty rough shape, but they look like they were quite grand in the day.
Inside the main building, it becomes clear that this wasn't a private residence.
It feels quite eerie, so you get a sense that this might have been some kind of a clinical place, a hospital ward.
This abandoned facility is a tale of two Germanys, with a tragic end.
This place started as an attempt to live up to mankind's highest ideals, but over time, it ended on a very different note.
Crystal Lau owns this site today. She spent years investigating the events that took place here during the 20th century.
Das ist die Domjüch. Der Komplex wurde errichtet 1902, ganz modern für die damalige Zeit.
These haunting-looking buildings started life as a psychiatric hospital with pioneering practices.
So this Domjüch Asylum, as it was known, and it reflected a sea change in how mental illness was treated.
At first, the belief was that people needed to be locked away with criminals, and eventually there was a realization that these people needed care for the symptoms that they had.
And even today, everyone remembers the names of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. The idea that psychiatric problems were a form of illness, that it was treatable.
One devotee of this changing view of psychotherapy was Dr. Carl Zerger.
Dr. Zerger was able to get funding to construct this new type of asylum, someplace pleasant in the countryside, open and airy, a place where the patients would receive medical treatment, but also be able to live in an environment that was conducive to getting better.
Weil er war begeistert davon. In diesem Gebäude für 64 Patientinnen errichtet.
Dr. Zerger rejected the traditional methods for dealing with violent patients.
There were these padded cells that had these very large windows and no bars. And this was so that the patients wouldn't feel as confined.
One resident was artist Wilhelm Müller.
We don't know exactly what his condition was. Some people speculate that it was schizophrenia. But he had an artistic talent, and the hospital encouraged his interest in art. And he would stand in his room and paint the view out of his window. Now, it might seem like painting the same view over and over is something that a mentally ill person might do, but you know, if you look at some of the great artists, Monet painted the same scenes multiple times in slightly different ways.
And so Wilhelm Müller, he painted like 110 paintings during his time there. And he gives us a real window into Domjüch and its workings during its heyday.
The idyllic life wouldn't last long. A shocking scandal involving Dr. Zerger would mark the beginning of Domjüch's downfall.
By all accounts, Dr. Zerger was a humane and accomplished administrator of this mental hospital. But his private life was problematic.
And like all pioneers, he aroused jealousy in his colleagues. And one of them accused Zerger of having an affair with the head nurse in the facility.
Zerger was a married man. And when the news reached the Medical Association, it led to a tragic turn of events.
This kind of behavior was a terrible scandal. And Dr. Zerger ultimately took his own life.
Like a Shakespearean tragedy and a double blow for the facility, the head nurse is also said to have committed suicide.
So this is quite awful because, you know, we see the people that were really kind of helping this place along and developing it removed from the scene.
Dr. Zerger was laid to rest in Domjüch's very own cemetery. But his legacy of humane treatment didn't last. In the 1930s, Germany embarked on a path that would have tragic consequences for the patients here.
When the Nazis came to power, they brought with them a whole set of ideas about eugenics, about improving the human race, or at least the German race.
So the Nazis are just obsessed with manipulating the gene pool to create a master race. So part of creating the master race is flushing out at any groups in the population that threaten the image of strength.
In July 1933, a new law was declared across Nazi Germany, the sterilization law.
One of their first campaigns was to eradicate hereditary diseases or mental illness or other things they thought might pass on from parent to child.
About 400,000 Germans were probably sterilized during this time. That's about 1% of the childbearing population.
So, of course, this campaign started in the mental hospitals. Many of the patients at Domjüch and other institutions were sterilized against their will.
Eugenics had become an established global movement, with support in countries including the US, Canada, and Great Britain. But the Nazis would take it to the next level.
In 1939, Hitler signed a decree authorizing his chief physician to start a program to euthanize those people that were considered unfit to live in German society.
Specifically, they will kill everyone afflicted with mental illness.
Domjüch did not escape Hitler's euthanasia program.
Der 11. Juli 1941 ist der schwärzeste Tag für diese Domjüch. An diesem Tag wurden hier, an dieser Stelle, in vorgefahrene graue Busse der GKAT 100 Patienten. 100 Patienten verfrachtet, muss man sagen. Denn viele von ihnen sind sicherlich nicht freiwillig eingestiegen.
Patients were taken to one of the 6 euthanasia facilities that had been established by the program.
Not every German was willing to overlook the horror that was unfolding.
The people could see what was going on. They knew what was happening. And so after a series of protests, Hitler did end the program in August of 1941.
The Germans learned a lot from the program, and Hitler realized that it was harder to convince the public that healthy people ought to be put to death against their will. In the future, he would run his extermination programs with a great deal more secrecy.
At the end of the Second World War, Domjüch passed into the hands of the Soviet Union.
They take Domjüch and they basically convert it into a barracks and headquarters for a Soviet unit that's part of the garrison of Eastern Germany.
They controlled the facility until the reunification of Germany in the 1990s. But they left the original buildings pretty much intact.
Today, the Association for the Preservation of Domjüch maintains the site. Their hard work helps keep the memory alive of both Dr. Serger's innovative practices and the victims of Hitler's ruthless policies.